Good day. Shots have been fired at President Reagan.
I heard a noise and we came out of the hotel and headed for the limousine. And I heard some noise and I thought it was firecrackers.
His press secretary, James Brady, shot through the head during the same assassination attempt this afternoon. Brady has now come out of 4.5 hours of surgery. Secret Service agent Tim McCarthy, also shot, is in good condition. District of Columbia policeman Thomas Delahanty is in serious but stable condition.
The Pope forgave the man who shot him. You forgive John Hinckley?
Yes. He wasn't thinking on all on all cylinders.
Nobody like Reagan. Welcome back to Newsmax Now. I'm John Bachman. 35 years ago today, President Reagan was shot while leaving a Washington, D.C. hotel after a meeting with the AFL-CIO. The man who shot him, the man Reagan prayed for, is walking around essentially a free man. Of course, his name is John Hinckley. He now lives mostly with his mom in southwestern Virginia. He also has to check in with a mental hospital in Washington, D.C., where he was confined for decades. Jurors found him not guilty by reason of insanity, saying he needed treatment, not a lifetime in prison. He plays guitar now. He likes to paint. He has a driver's license, but he does have to carry a GPS-enabled cell phone to go on any unsupervised activities. Just goes to show you, time goes on. And joining us right now, two experts on the Reagan assassination attempt. And while it still matters 35 years later, Quentin Wilber and Craig Shirley. Mr. Wilber is the author of Rawhide Down in the near assassination of Ronald Reagan. Of course, we all know Craig Shirley. He's a frequent guest on this program. He is the author of Last Act, the final years and emerging legacy of Ronald Reagan. Gentlemen, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, Del, let's start with you. How close did Ronald Reagan actually come to dying 35 years ago?
Oh, he came within a split second, an inch, and a split second decision. You know, this was one of the most dramatic days in U.S. presidential history. People don't really understand how close Reagan came and how that transformed the president and thus transformed the world. And I think you really only understand it once you set the scene for that day, March 30th, 1981, 2:27 p.m. At actually almost this precise moment, 35 years ago today, Reagan walked out of the Washington Hilton Hotel after giving a rather, regular, normal speech, and he was 15 feet away from his limousine and 15 feet away from a crowd when John Hinckley, the man you just mentioned, opened fire, unleashing 6 shots at the president in 1.7 seconds.
And it's amazing, how quickly everything transpired, but yet Reagan didn't really realize he had been shot. Craig, there are so many pivotal moments from that day that if different decisions were made, it would have gone the other way. There are also things that Reagan did were remarkable when you think about him, like refusing to use a stretcher when he was being taken into George Washington Hospital. Now, did he do that because he really didn't know how bad he was hurt, or was it because he knew the whole world was watching and he didn't want them to know how badly he was injured, how serious the situation was?
Well, first of all, Del has written the definitive book, Rawhide Down, and it's just marvelous, and I recommend it to all. I think Reagan was very manly. I think he refused. He knew people were watching. He refused to go in on a stretcher or go in a wheelchair. He was going to walk into the hospital under his own steam. He also knew the Soviets were watching. He, of course, collapsed as soon as he got in, but the devastator bullet, which did explode in James Brady's head, didn't explode in Ronald Reagan's head. If Jerry Parr, the Secret Service agent, as Del said, made a decision to go to the White House instead of George Washington Hospital, Reagan would have died. If the bullet had gone 1 inch further, it would have pierced Reagan's heart and killed him. There were so many near misses that changed Reagan's life and changed the world that day, as Del said.
We'll talk about Jerry Parr in a little bit, because he's very important in this story, as you mentioned. But I want to talk about Al Haig, too, as Secretary of State at the time. And anybody who remembers what took place, I was only 2 at the time, but this was taught in history, and I think it's always taught as a lesson for any White House staff. Everybody gets a briefing on the 25th Amendment. Al Haig came out and gave that press conference and said, "I'm in charge here." But again, this probably wouldn't happen if there were a similar situation, because this really defined the succession and why it's so important that there is a clear succession in place, right?
Well, on this day, the script got tossed out at 2:27 p.m. There was no script, right? In fact, the 25th Amendment was so new, relatively speaking, that Ted Olson, one of the top advisors to the Attorney General, opened his pocket Constitution after learning the president had been shot, and it was such an old Constitution by just like a decade that it didn't have the 25th Amendment in it. Right?
Wow.
In fact, there was such a consequential conversation, one of the most consequential conversations in U.S. presidential history, between Ed Meese and Jim Baker, the two of the top aides to Reagan. Do we transfer power to the vice president? Do we invoke the 25th Amendment? And the day was so dramatic, so fast-moving, there was no script for it. That conversation happened in a broom closet just down the hall from where Reagan was undergoing surgery. It was that insane. Yeah. And so, as you just mentioned, going forward, Fred Fielding, the White House counsel, now says, looking back, we should have invoked the 25th Amendment. Yeah. And that's where Al Haig kind of, obviously, everyone says, I'm in charge here, but no, actually, he went on camera, national television, and botched it by saying, I'm in control here. And as you noted, the presidential succession kind of confused him. Yeah, that's one of the things that is everybody make sure is in place now. Everybody knows the rules. Jerry Parr, influential, made that decision to go to George Washington Hospital, which saved Reagan's life. But I want to talk about, with just about a minute left, guys, we talk about the Cold War, how Reagan ended that. What would the world be like today if Reagan didn't survive? First to you, Craig.
If Reagan hadn't survived, I think that George Bush would have pursued a more moderate policy, would have pursued renewed détente with the Soviets after he got past the '84 election and was elected in his own right. The Cold War would have maybe gone on longer. The Soviet Union would have existed longer because he wouldn't have forced the Soviets to the negotiating table the way Reagan did. He would not have given the speeches eviscerating the Soviet Union, the Soviet leadership, the way Reagan did. He would, in a way, kind of propped up the Soviets the way previous American presidents had done so. Reagan is significant in history because he doesn't prop up the Soviet Union. He says we're going to consign them to the ash heap of history. Bush never would have said something like that. It's
hard to imagine. Del, last word to you, about 20 seconds left.
I can't say it better than Craig did. I think he understands Reagan and Reagan's legacy far better than I ever did. I believe at one point, didn't Reagan, Craig, say to Dick Allen when they were meeting right before he took over, right before he ran for president, he said, my philosophy is this with the Soviet Union: we win, they lose.
That's exactly right, Del.
So I think that's pretty.
It's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine what would have happened. So many influential moments in that brief period of time that day, 35 years ago. Gentlemen, a pleasure marking this anniversary with you, and thank God Reagan lived. I think everybody can say that, even folks who didn't like him. Craig, Del, Quentin, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
All right, we got more to come here on Newsmax Now. We're coming back after this.